What would happen if a girl of just 12 was forced into marriage? Have you ever imagined such a fate? Dark clouds loom over medieval Europe. The silence of stone castles hides a cruel truth. Innocence exchanged for power, childhood sacrificed at the altar of politics. Imagine being 12 years old. Your days should be filled with laughter and play, with the carefree joy of youth. But in the secret chambers of kings and nobles, your life has already been signed away. Not as a child, not even as a person, but as a pawn. This is the story of Isabella of Valois, a princess draped in jewels at an age when she should have been clutching toys. Forced into marriage with a king more than 3 times her age, her childhood was stolen beneath the weight of a crown. Her tragedy is more than a tale of one girl. It is the reflection of an age where women were treated as property, and the cries of children vanished into the silence of history. Beneath the painted portraits and royal titles hides a story of pain, betrayal, and innocence lost. A story that warns us, even today, of the price paid when power outweighs humanity. So, as Isabella's fate unfolds, ask yourself, what is a crown worth if it costs a child her soul? The year was 1389, and the palace of the French Valois dynasty shimmered with jewels, music, and celebration. Bells rang across Paris, their echo carried through the cobbled streets, announcing the birth of another princess. She was named Isabella. To the people, she was a symbol of hope, a child of royal blood destined to strengthen France's future. But to the court, she was something else entirely. A piece on a chessboard, small yet powerful in the ruthless game of kingdoms. Inside the grand halls, where banners of gold and blue swayed under candlelight, Isabella's world began with warmth and comfort. Surrounded by silks, nurses, and maids, her childhood was wrapped in privilege. Yet, beneath that glitter, shadows already crept close. For in the eyes of monarchs and ministers, her innocence was never meant to last. As a little girl, Isabella wandered the gardens of the palace. She touched the roses, watched the swans glide across the waters, and laughed with the other children of the court. Her small hands reached for toys carved of ivory. Her voice rang with the high-pitched joy of youth. To any ordinary observer, she was just another child, blissfully unaware of the dangers beyond the castle walls. But every moment of her laughter carried a silent truth. Her life was not hers to live. Every smile, every game, every carefree day was merely borrowed time before the crown would tighten its grip. The palace where Isabella grew up was more than a home. It was a fortress of politics. Courtiers whispered in corridors, ambassadors carried secrets across borders, and alliances shifted like sand in the wind. From the very beginning, Isabella was not raised as a daughter, but as an investment, watched carefully, protected obsessively, not for who she was, but for what she could one day provide. And still, she remained unaware. To her, the world was filled with lullabies and golden light. She knew nothing of the treaties signed in her name, nothing of the blood spilled in wars that would one day drag her across borders. In her eyes, the world was still safe. At the age of 6, Isabella's innocence radiated from her small frame. Portraits of her painted by court artists captured a girl with bright, wide eyes, her hair adorned with pearls too heavy for her delicate neck. The artists praised her beauty, but their admiration was not for her childhood charm. It was for the political currency of her appearance. The softer her features, the more easily she could be used to symbolize peace between rival kingdoms. Her tutors filled her days with lessons, languages, manners, the duties of queenship. But while other children learned letters and songs, Isabella was trained to bow, to smile, to endure the weight of royal expectation. Her games were not of freedom, but rehearsals of duty. Even in play, her destiny pressed down on her small shoulders. The corridors of the palace grew colder as she grew older. Whispers followed her everywhere, whispers not of her laughter, but of her value. She would make a fine bride for England, some said. A treaty in silk and flesh, others muttered. Though Isabella could not yet understand the meaning of these words, their shadow lingered at the edges of her childhood. Her world was gilded, but it was a cage. She was dressed in gowns stitched with gold thread, yet forbidden to chase the wind like other children. She was surrounded by hundreds of attendants, yet deprived of the one thing she needed most: freedom. And in the background, the world around her trembled. France and England were locked in endless war. Kingdoms rose and fell on fragile treaties, and every fragile treaty needed a sacrifice. That sacrifice would be her. By the time Isabella turned 10, her life had already been mapped. Every step she took was watched, every smile rehearsed, every breath measured against the expectations of her dynasty. Childhood had been stolen not with violence, but with velvet gloves, soft enough to seem gentle, tight enough to suffocate. The palace still glimmered. The roses still bloomed in the gardens. The swans still drifted on the waters. But for Isabella, each petal, each reflection, each note of laughter marked the passing of something she would never regain. For even as she played with dolls, her future was being signed away with ink and sealed with wax. Her story, the story of a girl too young to know her fate, was only beginning. And as the clock ticked closer to her 12th year, the walls of the palace seemed to close tighter around her, preparing her not for life, but for sacrifice. The innocence of Isabella's childhood began to fade, not because she grew wiser, but because the world around her demanded it. Beyond the walls of her palace, France and England were at war, a brutal conflict that had dragged on for decades, staining fields with blood and starving cities into silence. Kings and nobles spoke, not of peace but of power. Their councils were filled with strategies, betrayals, and endless calculations. And Isabella's name was whispered in those same chambers, not as a daughter, not as a child, but as a solution. The court of France had learned to see people as tools. Generals were pawns, peasants were expendable, and daughters, especially royal daughters, were bargaining chips. In this ruthless world, innocence was weakness, and weakness was crushed without mercy. Isabella, though barely 10 years old, was already seen as an answer to a war that had swallowed generations. The King of England, old and hardened by years of battle, sought peace only on his own terms. His kingdom had lost countless soldiers, his treasury was drained, yet his thirst for control was unbroken. France, equally battered, sought survival in alliances. But in the eyes of rulers, treaties were never sealed with promises. They were sealed with flesh. Isabella's youth became her value. She was a child, pure and untouched, which made her the perfect offering. To kings, the idea of a girl barely entering her teenage years was not shameful, it was useful. They believed such a bride could bind kingdoms together, an unbreakable knot of bloodlines and vows. Her tender age was not a reason to wait, it was a reason to act. Behind velvet curtains, secret negotiations began. Ambassadors traveled under the cover of night, carrying letters sealed with wax, filled with the cold language of power. Isabella's future was written in these letters, her name traded across tables like a coin, her fate decided by men she would never meet. Inside the palace, her parents smiled at her, yet their smiles were lined with shadows. They knew her destiny was no longer her own. The King of France, her father, saw her as a bridge, a way to hold the kingdom together through fragile diplomacy. The Queen, though softer in heart, could not resist the iron logic of politics. To them, Isabella's life was not about her, it was about France. And so the world around her grew darker. While Isabella played with her dolls in gilded rooms, outside, men sharpened swords, burned villages, and plotted ambushes. Every drop of blood spilled on the battlefield pushed her closer to the fate chosen for her. The ruthless world of kings was not built on love, compassion, or humanity. It was built on survival, and survival demanded sacrifice. For Isabella, that sacrifice was childhood itself. The French court began preparing her. Tailors dressed her, in gowns too heavy for her young body, their weight symbolizing the burden she would soon carry. Tutors instructed her in the customs of England, a land she had never seen, but one that would soon become her prison. Priests whispered prayers over her, not for her soul, but for the kingdom she was about to serve. Even the people of France began to see her differently. To the poor, she was hope, a child who might bring peace to a bleeding land. To the nobles, she was leverage, a chance to secure their own power. And to the kings, she was nothing more than a piece in a larger game. The world of kings had no room for innocence. It crushed weakness and devoured the helpless. And Isabella, though still a child, was already trapped in its jaws. As her 12th birthday drew near, the whispers grew louder. The war had dragged on too long, and the kings demanded resolution. There would be no more waiting. Isabella would be given away, married to a man far older, far colder, and far more ruthless than she could ever imagine. Her fate had been sealed. The ruthless world of kings had claimed her, and there was no escape. The decision came not with thunder, not with war drums, but with whispers in the royal court. Behind heavy oak doors and beneath golden chandeliers, men gathered, men who carried titles of power, but hearts as cold as stone. They spoke of kingdoms, treaties, and bloodlines. Yet through all their words, one name lingered on their lips: Isabella. France and England had been locked in war for nearly a century. Neither side had won, and neither side could afford to lose. The battlefield had drained them of soldiers and silver alike, but kings were never willing to surrender pride. And so, when the sword could not bring peace, they turned to the chains of marriage. The bargain was struck in secret. A child would become a queen, and in her innocence, two kingdoms would bind themselves together. That child was Isabella of Valois. She was only 12. The negotiations were cold and calculated. Ambassadors from England pressed their demands, their eyes fixed not on the little girl, but on the lands and wealth her marriage would secure. The French crown, desperate for a fragile peace, gave way. Isabella's body, her future, her life, all of it became part of the contract, sealed, with royal signatures and the weight of ancient wax. No one asked her. No one cared. Her laughter, her dreams, her tears, they were irrelevant. To the kings, she was not a daughter, not a child, but a vessel to carry the burden of peace, a vessel to silence the war, a vessel to be owned. Preparations for the wedding began at once. Seamstresses worked day and night, weaving gowns of silk and gold so heavy they crushed her small frame. Jewels were placed upon her, sparkling chains that looked like treasures but felt like shackles. She was paraded through the palace halls as though she were already a queen, though in truth, she was little more than a lamb dressed for sacrifice. Whispers followed her everywhere. Servants bowed lower than before, but their eyes carried pity. Nobles smiled at her, but their smiles were masks, hiding greed and calculation. To them, she was a living treaty. The English king awaiting her was no Prince Charming, no noble protector. He was Richard II, a man nearly 3 times her age, hardened by years of power and infamous for his cruelty. He did not see Isabella as a partner, nor even as a wife. To him, she was property, proof of victory, a jewel to display, a symbol that France had bent to his will. On the day the marriage contract was announced, Isabella's childhood ended. She stood in the great hall of her father's palace, her hands trembling beneath the weight of jeweled rings, her hair braided and crowned with gold. The courtiers cheered, but their voices sounded hollow, like echoes in a tomb. In that moment, she was no longer Isabella, the child who loved laughter and gardens. She was Isabella, Queen of England, a title that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The bargain was complete. Her fate was sealed. The innocence of a child had been sold in exchange for peace that would never last. And as the court celebrated with music and wine, Isabella sat in silence, her wide eyes filled with the terror of a future she could not escape. The morning of departure was cloaked in sorrow. The palace bells rang softly, their echoes drifting through the halls like a funeral song. 12-year-old Isabella stood in her chamber, dressed not in the simple gowns she loved, but in the heavy silks of a queen-to-be. The gown swallowed her small frame, its embroidery glittering like chains of gold. She clutched a doll in her hand, the last remnant of her childhood, yet even that was soon taken from her. "A queen does not carry toys," the governess whispered, and the doll was gone, snatched away as if her innocence itself had been confiscated. The courtyard was filled with carriages and guards, their armor gleaming under the cold dawn. Nobles and courtiers bowed as Isabella appeared, but their faces carried not compassion, only calculation. She was to be delivered across the sea, like an offering. Her mother wept silently, pressing trembling kisses to Isabella's forehead. But even the Queen of France had no power to stop what was happening. "Be strong, my child," she murmured, her voice breaking. Isabella tried to be brave, but her eyes brimmed with tears as she clung to her mother's gown. She was not ready. She was not prepared. But history did not wait for children. The carriages rolled out of the palace gates, carrying Isabella away from the only world she had ever known. The French countryside passed by in a blur, villages, forests, rivers, all fading into memory. She stared out of the window, her heart aching with every mile that took her farther from home. When the journey reached the coast, the sea stretched before her like an endless, merciless void. The ships of England waited, their sails towering high like the wings of dark creatures. The salty air stung her eyes, and the waves crashed violently against the shore, as though the sea itself resisted this union. Yet no force of nature could defy the will of kings. The crossing was long and brutal. Storms lashed at the ship, tossing it upon the waves as though mocking the fragile child it carried. Isabella clung to her bed, seasick and terrified, her small body shivering with fear. The sailors whispered that it was an ill omen. A queen who begins her journey in tears will bring nothing but sorrow. At last, the English coast emerged from the mist, grey and foreboding. The cliffs rose like jagged teeth, and beyond them lay a land that was colder, harsher, and far less welcoming than the home she had left behind. When Isabella arrived in London, the air was heavy with smoke and suspicion. Crowds gathered to glimpse their new queen, but there was no warmth in their eyes. They looked upon her as one looks upon a curiosity. A child draped in jewels, barely able to walk beneath the weight of her gown. Some whispered, some scoffed, and some turned away in silence. She was taken to the palace, a fortress of stone and shadow. The walls loomed over her, and the corridors stretched endlessly, cold and unwelcoming. Servants bowed as she passed, but their eyes carried pity, as if they already knew the sorrow that awaited her. That night, Isabella lay alone in her vast chamber. The bed was enormous, its canopy heavy with golden fabric, yet it felt like a prison. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant echo of footsteps, and for the first time, she realized that her life no longer belonged to her. She was no longer Isabella, the child of France. She was Isabella, Queen of England, exiled from her childhood, trapped in a foreign land, and bound to a man she did not yet know, but would soon fear. And as the wind howled outside the palace walls, she closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer. A prayer for freedom, a prayer for safety, a prayer for a childhood stolen too soon. But in the darkness, no answer came, only silence. The first time Isabella met Richard II, she trembled. He was not a gentle figure of safety, nor the kind protector she had been promised. He was a man hardened by years of betrayal, paranoia, and ruthless ambition. His eyes, sharp and restless, carried no softness for the child standing before him. Instead, they assessed her coldly, as one might examine a jewel, valuable only for the power it represented. The wedding was held with extravagant ceremony. Golden banners fluttered in the wind, choirs sang hymns, and the nobility of England and France assembled to witness the union. Yet beneath the splendor, a disturbing truth lingered. The bride was a child. Isabella, dressed in a gown so heavy she could scarcely move, walked down the aisle with trembling steps. The crown placed upon her head was too large. It slid forward, almost covering her eyes. The people cheered, but their cheers sounded hollow, echoing like laughter in a nightmare. Richard, far older and far more powerful, leaned close to the child bride as if claiming possession of her. He whispered words of duty, of loyalty, of obedience, phrases that Isabella did not understand but instinctively feared. In that moment, she ceased to be Isabella the girl. She became Isabella the symbol, Isabella the pawn, Isabella the queen in name, but prisoner in reality. Life in the English court was merciless. The nobles whispered constantly, their words dripping with suspicion. Some mocked Richard for marrying a child, calling it desperation for peace with France. Others sneered at Isabella, dismissing her as a French puppet. Every glance she received was a reminder that she did not belong. Richard himself was a man consumed by paranoia. His reign was threatened by rebellion, and he trusted no one, not his lords, not his council, not even his queen. In private, he rarely spoke to Isabella with kindness. His words were commands, his presence an unshakable weight. When he walked into a room, silence followed like a shadow. Isabella would lower her eyes, too frightened to meet his gaze, too young to understand the politics that bound her to this stranger. Nights in the palace were the most terrifying. Isabella slept alone in chambers heavy with silence, yet never free from fear. She knew that at any moment Richard could summon her, not as a husband seeks a wife, but as a king claims his property. The candlelight flickered against the walls, casting monstrous shadows that danced around her bed. Each creak of the wooden floor, each whisper of the wind, made her heart race. Her attendants pitied her, though they dared not speak openly. Sometimes, in hushed voices, they told her tales of other queens, of other brides, who had endured the same cruel fate. But none of their stories brought comfort. They only deepened Isabella's fear that she had been trapped in a cycle older than herself, a cycle where women were sacrifices and children were currency. And so, Isabella learned silence. She learned to bow her head, to hide her tears, to let the mask of duty cover the wounds of her heart. She was a queen draped in gold, but within her, the child still cried, longing for home, longing for freedom. As the months passed, Richard's grip on power grew weaker, his enemies stronger. Rebellions brewed, conspiracies thickened, and the court became a nest of vipers. Isabella, too young to understand all, could feel the storm approaching. She saw it in the king's restless eyes, in the sharp whispers that echoed through the corridors, in the way the courtiers' smiles never reached their eyes. The ruthless king was preparing for war, and the silent queen, though voiceless, was trapped in the center of the storm. The palace walls, once echoing with chants of loyalty, now whispered with secrets. Servants exchanged uneasy glances, messengers rode faster through the night, and nobles disappeared into darkened chambers for secret councils. The rebellion against Richard II was no longer a rumor, it was a reality. Isabella, though only a child, felt it in every breath of the court. The halls seemed colder, the voices sharper, the air itself heavy with treachery. She would sit quietly in her chambers, listening to muffled conversations behind doors. Words like usurper, tyrant, betrayal drifted through the cracks, each one striking her like a blade. Richard grew restless. His paranoia deepened with each passing day. He stormed through the palace like a caged beast, lashing out at courtiers, accusing loyal men of treason, punishing without reason. His eyes, once sharp with calculation, now burned with desperation. And yet, in his desperation, he clung to Isabella more fiercely than ever, not out of love, but out of fear. She was his symbol of peace with France, his shield against the storm, his last fragile claim to legitimacy. But to the rebels, she was nothing. A foreign child, too young to wield power, too powerless to alter her fate. To them, she was merely collateral damage in their war against the king. One evening, as autumn's chill spread through the stone corridors, Isabella sat at her window, watching the sky darken with gathering clouds. Torches flickered in the courtyard below, where soldiers trained relentlessly, their armor clashing in grim preparation. She clutched her hands together, whispering silent prayers she barely understood. Deep down, she felt it. The storm was not approaching. It had already begun. Then came the day of dread. The rebels, led by Henry Bolingbroke, advanced with terrifying force. The kingdom trembled. Richard marched to defend his crown, leaving Isabella behind in the palace. Before his departure, he came to her chambers, his face hardened, his voice edged with command. "Pray for your king," he said. But Isabella did not pray for him. She prayed for herself. The days stretched into silence. News from the battlefield arrived slowly, each report darker than the last. Richard was betrayed by those he trusted, abandoned by men who once swore allegiance. His power crumbled like sand slipping through clenched fists. Finally, the truth reached the palace. Richard had been captured. The ruthless king who had once terrified his subjects was now a prisoner. And Isabella, the silent queen, was left alone in a foreign land, a child widow to a living king. She was only 12. In that moment, she understood the cruel weight of her marriage. She had not been brought to England for peace, nor for love, nor even for duty. She had been sacrificed to a collapsing throne, chained to a man whose downfall would drag her into despair. The rebellion had not only destroyed a king, it had shattered the innocence of a child. The throne room stood silent. Where once trumpets had blared and courtiers bowed, now the air was thick with dread. Richard II, once draped in the majesty of a king, was dragged before his enemies, his crown stripped, his pride shattered. The man who had ruled with cruelty, who had silenced dissent with iron fists, was now reduced to a prisoner, trembling under the judgment of men who had once knelt before him. Far from the council chamber, Isabella sat in her lonely chamber. The echoes of the court's chaos drifted to her like faint thunder, a storm raging outside while she remained trapped in its eye. She was not summoned to speak, not asked for, her thoughts not even acknowledged. She was a queen only in name, discarded the moment her husband's power crumbled. When Richard was forced to abdicate, the crown was torn from his grasp and placed on the head of Henry Bolingbroke, now Henry IV. Isabella, still only a child, became the living ghost of a fallen dynasty. She was too young to comprehend the intricacies of politics, but old enough to feel the humiliation. She had been paraded as a bride, celebrated as a queen, but now she was abandoned like a pawn no longer useful in the game. Richard's downfall was swift and merciless. Imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, he wasted away, his spirit broken, his body weakened. Rumors spread that he starved, others whispered he was murdered. Whatever the truth, his death marked the end of Isabella's brief, tragic reign. When the news reached her, she did not weep, she did not scream. She sat still, her hands trembling in her lap, her face pale as marble. The courtiers around her murmured, but no one dared to touch her. She was a widow now, at the age of 12. The corridors of the palace became her prison. Once adorned with silks, now she wore black, draped in mourning, not for a husband she had never truly known, but for the childhood that had been stolen from her. Outside, the people of England rejoiced at Richard's death, celebrating the new king. But inside those stone walls, Isabella was consumed by silence. Her family in France demanded her return, but Henry IV refused at first. She was too valuable. Still, a bargaining chip in the ruthless world of politics. For months she was kept in England, grieving in isolation, denied even the comfort of home. Every day stretched like an eternity, each hour a reminder that she was nothing more than a child, caught in the games of powerful men. When she was finally allowed to return to France, she was broken. Not by physical chains, but by the invisible scars of betrayal and loss. She had left her homeland as a hopeful girl, draped in bridal finery, believing she was destined to be queen. She returned as a widow, cloaked in mourning, her youth stolen before it had even begun. This was not the story of a love match. It was the story of a child devoured by the hunger of kings. The carriage wheels groaned as they crossed the stony roads of France. The once celebrated bride of England now returned to her homeland in mourning veils, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Crowds gathered in silence, watching as Isabella stepped down, no longer the child queen who had been given away like a jewel to be traded. She was 12 years old, yet she walked with the grief of a widow twice her age. France received her with pity, not celebration. To them, she was a symbol of a failed alliance, a living reminder that political marriages often brought nothing but sorrow. Courtiers bowed, nobles offered condolences, yet none could give back what had been taken from her. Her innocence, her childhood, her freedom. Isabella was placed under the care of her father's household. In the halls of the French court, whispers followed her. The widow of England, the queen who never was. She had lived through war, through betrayal, through loss. Yet she had never been given a chance to simply live as a girl. Years passed, and France sought to use her once again as a political tool. But Isabella, scarred by her first marriage, resisted. She refused Henry IV's demands to marry his son. For the first time, she found the strength to defy kings. She had been silenced as a child bride, broken as a child widow. But as a young woman, she seized what little control she could. Eventually, she remarried into the French nobility, not as a pawn in foreign games, but as a woman reclaiming her voice. Yet even in her defiance, her life remained short. Isabella died at just 19, her body weakened by years of sorrow, her spirit crushed by the burdens forced upon her. She never saw peace, never lived to tell her story. History remembered her not for her will, but for her suffering. And that is the tragedy of Isabella of Valois. A girl who should have laughed in gardens, learned in schools, and grown in freedom, was instead married off at 12, widowed at 12, and dead before 20. Her story is more than just a tale of medieval cruelty. It is a mirror reflecting the countless children across history, and even today, who are stripped of their childhoods in the name of politics, power, and tradition. The lesson lingers like a shadow. When innocence is sacrificed to satisfy the hunger of kings, nations may gain crowns, but humanity loses its soul. As the curtains fall on Isabella's story, the question remains: how many more children must be broken before the world learns that no throne, no alliance, no empire is worth the price of a stolen childhood?